They say the only thing cheaper than a life in the Dakota Territory in 1884 was a promise. Men didn't come out west to find themselves. They came to lose themselves, or to find something shiny enough to make the losing worth it. But when the snows came early to the Black Hills, covering the world in a white silence that could freeze a scream in your throat, the gold didn't matter anymore. A man named Elias Thorne learned the hard way that when the devil sits at your campfire, he doesn't wear horns. He wears the face of your partners. Elias was broken, starving, and left for dead in a canyon that even the wolves avoided. His partners took his horse. They took his rifle. They took his boots. They left him nothing but the biting wind and the certainty of death. But they made one miscalculation. They forgot about the dog. They thought the beast would follow the food, follow the strength. They were wrong. This isn't just a story about survival. It is a testament to the only creature on God's green earth that will starve beside you rather than feast without you. This is the story of the dog who waited 7 winters. Hello everyone, I'm Hudson, and welcome to the History Machine. If you value stories of unshakable loyalty and the raw fight for survival, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a tale from the frontier. Let's ride. The year was 1884, and the wind cutting through the Deadman's Pass felt less like air and more like broken glass. It was late October, a time when the high country whispers warnings to any man foolish enough to be caught above the timberline. Elias Thorne was a man of 45 years, though the sun and the hard miles had chiseled his face into something that looked much older. He wasn't a hero in the dime novel sense. He was a surveyor, a man of maps and measurements, a man who believed in the order of things. He believed that if you did the work, you got the pay. If you gave your word, you kept it. But the 3 men riding ahead of him didn't share that philosophy. They were a rough outfit. There was Vance, a heavy-set man with eyes like polished flint, who led the expedition not by wisdom, but by volume. Then there was Kidder, a nervous, wire-thin boy from Missouri who would shoot his own shadow if it moved too fast. And Grady, a silence-filled man who did whatever Vance told him to do. They had spent 3 months prospecting the upper ridges of the territory, chasing a rumor of a vein that an old Sioux scout had mentioned in passing. They found nothing but fool's gold and granite. The frustration had been building like the pressure in a steam boiler. Supplies were low, flour was full of weevils, the coffee was gone, and patience had evaporated weeks ago. It happened on a Tuesday, under a slate-grey sky that promised a storm of biblical proportions. Elias was bringing up the rear, leading the pack mule, his dog Barnaby trotting faithfully at the heels of his horse. Barnaby wasn't a majestic beast. He was a mix of shepherd and wolfhound, with a coat the color of dried tobacco and one ear that flopped over, a souvenir from a badger fight years ago. He was a dog of few barks but deep instincts. He had been with Elias for 5 years, ever since Elias found him starving in an alley in Deadwood. As they navigated a narrow switchback, the shale loose and treacherous underfoot, Elias's horse spooked. Maybe it was a scent on the wind, a mountain lion stalking the ridge, or maybe the horse was just as tired and hungry as the men. The beast reared, its hooves scrabbling for purchase on the icy rock. Elias, an experienced rider, tried to correct the animal, but the ground gave way. It wasn't a dramatic slide, just a sickening crunch of gravity taking over. The horse went over the edge, tumbling 20 feet down into a ravine, taking Elias with it. The fall was violent. Elias hit the rocks with a force that knocked the breath out of him, his leg snapping audibly against a protruding boulder. The horse screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound that echoed off the canyon walls, and then fell silent, its neck broken. Elias lay in the snow, the world spinning in nauseating circles. Pain, white and hot, shot up his leg, radiating through his entire body. He tried to move, to call out, but all that came was a groan. Barnaby was there instantly. The dog had scrambled down the slope, whining, licking the snow off Elias's face, his warm breath a stark contrast to the freezing air. Above, on the trail, 3 silhouettes looked down. "He dead?" Vance's voice drifted down, devoid of concern. "Horses," Grady replied, spitting tobacco juice over the edge. Elias gathered every ounce of his strength. "I'm alive!" he shouted, though his voice was thin. "Legs broke. Get the rope." He waited. He expected to see the rope coiling down. He expected the grumbling assistance of men who were bound by the unwritten law of the trail. You don't leave a man behind. But the rope didn't come. Vance stood on the ledge, looking at the sky, then at the supplies on the mule, then down at Elias. The calculation was visible even from 20 feet down. A storm was coming. They were 3 days from the nearest outpost. They had enough food for 3 men for 2 days, maybe. A man with a broken leg in this terrain wasn't a passenger. He was an anchor. "We can't haul him, Vance," Kidder said, his voice trembling. "Not with the snow coming. He'll slow us down. We'll all die." "Throw down the rope," Elias yelled again, panic starting to mix with the pain. "Vance, Grady, don't you do this." Vance squatted by the edge. "Elias," he called down, his tone conversational, as if discussing the price of beans. "You know how it is. That leg is bad. We haul you up. We gotta carry you. We carry you. We move a mile a day. Storm hits tonight. We'd be digging 4 graves by Friday." "You can't leave me!" Elias screamed. He tried to push himself up, but the agony in his leg made him black out for a second. When his vision cleared, he saw Vance standing up. "Leave the rifle with him?" Kidder asked. Vance shook his head. "We need the ammo. He won't be needing it. The water. Take it." It was a sentencing, cold, practical, and murderous. They began to divide the load on the pack mule. Elias watched, helpless, as they tightened the cinches. He watched them turn their backs. It was a betrayal so absolute it felt surreal. "Barnaby!" Vance whistled sharply. "Here, boy! Come on!" The dog looked up at the men, then down at Elias. Vance whistled again, slapping his thigh. "Come on, you mutt! Meat! We got meat!" Barnaby took 2 steps up the slope. Elias felt his heart shatter. If the dog left, the loneliness would kill him before the cold did. "Go on, Barnaby," Elias whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Go with them. Live." But Barnaby stopped. He looked at Vance, who was holding out a strip of jerky. The dog let out a low, rumbling growl, the hackles on his back rising like a rigid brush. He turned his back on the food, on the safety of the pack, and walked back to Elias. He curled up against Elias's broken side, laying his heavy head on the man's chest. "Suit yourself, dumb animal," Vance sneered. "More rations for us." And just like that, they were gone. The sound of hoofbeats faded quickly into the rising wind. Elias, Thorne, and Barnaby were alone in the vast, indifferent cathedral of the Rockies. The silence that followed was heavy. Elias lay still, assessing the damage. His right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle just below the knee. The bone hadn't broken the skin, thank God, but the swelling was already straining against his trousers. He had his coat, his hat, a knife in his belt, a box of lucifer matches in his pocket, and the clothes on his back. No food, no water, no weapon. "We're in a bad way, Barnaby," Elias murmured. The dog thumped his tail once against the snow, his yellow eyes watching Elias's face intently. The first priority was heat. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Elias knew he couldn't climb out of the ravine, not today. He had to find shelter. About 50 yards away, near the base of the cliff, there was a shallow overhang, a depression in the rock protected by a screen of scrub pine. The crawl to that shelter was a journey of miles measured in inches. Elias had to drag his useless leg, pulling himself through the snow with his elbows. Every movement was a fresh explosion of pain. He would drag himself 2 feet, then collapse, gasping, sweat freezing on his forehead. Barnaby seemed to understand. He didn't run ahead. He walked beside Elias, occasionally grabbing the sleeve of Elias's coat with his teeth and tugging gently, as if trying to share the burden. It took an hour to cover the 50 yards. By the time Elias rolled under the overhang, the first heavy flakes of the blizzard were beginning to fall. He was exhausted, trembling uncontrollably. He managed to gather some dead branches from the scrub pine, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He built a small pyramid of twigs. He struck a match. The wind blew it out. He struck a second. It flared and died. He only had 10 matches. Panic began to claw at his throat. He cupped his hands, shielding the 3rd match like it was the soul of the world. The flame caught the dry needles. Smoke curled up, then fire. Elias fed the fire slowly, hoarding the wood. As the darkness settled, the temperature plummeted to 0. He huddled against the rock wall, pulling his coat tight. But it wasn't enough. The cold was a living thing, seeking out every gap in his clothing. Then Barnaby moved. The big dog stepped over Elias's legs and curled up directly on top of him, covering Elias's chest and abdomen with his massive furry body. The heat radiating from the animal was immediate. Barnaby rested his chin on Elias's shoulder, his breathing steady and rhythmic. It was a furnace of life. Elias wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in the coarse fur. That first night was a delirium of pain and cold. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness. In his fever dreams, he saw Vance laughing, counting gold coins that turned into skulls. He saw his wife, who had died of smallpox 10 years ago, beckoning him to a warm table. But every time he started to drift too far toward that inviting light, a rough tongue would lick his face, or a low whine would pull him back to the sharp, brutal reality of the cave. Barnaby wouldn't let him sleep the sleep of the dead. By morning the world had changed. 3 feet of snow had fallen. The ravine was a white bowl. Elias woke up thirsty, his mouth tasting like old copper. He ate snow, knowing it would lower his body temperature, but having no choice. His leg was a swollen log of purple and blue. He knew he had to set it, or he would never walk again. He looked at Barnaby. "This is going to get ugly, boy." Elias found a sturdy branch among his firewood. He cut strips from his own shirt. He wedged his foot between 2 heavy rocks. He needed to pull the bone into alignment. He bit down on a piece of leather strap. He looked into Barnaby's eyes. The dog whimpered, sensing the anticipation of pain. Elias pulled. The scream that tore from his throat was primal. It was the sound of an animal caught in a trap. He pulled until the world went black. When he came to, he was lying flat on his back, panting, tears streaming into his ears. The leg looked straighter. He bound it tightly with the splint and the rags. For 3 days the storm raged. They couldn't leave the overhang. They had no food. Elias chewed on pine needles to trick his stomach. Barnaby paced the edge of the shelter, snapping at snowflakes, his ribs beginning to show. On the 4th day, the sky cleared to a piercing, brilliant blue. The sun was out, but it offered no heat. Elias knew they were dying. The hunger had passed the stage of pain and entered the stage of lethargy. It would be so easy to just close his eyes. Barnaby stood at the edge of the snow, sniffing the air. Suddenly his ears pricked up. He looked back at Elias, gave a short bark, and bolted out into the deep snow. "Barnaby, no! Save your strength!" Elias rasped. But the dog was gone, disappearing over the ridge of the ravine. Elias felt a hollow pit in his stomach. Had the dog finally given up? Had instinct overridden loyalty? Was Barnaby running to find the trail of the men who had food? Elias couldn't blame him. It was nature. Elias spent the day staring at the white emptiness, feeling the abandonment wash over him again. Vance had left him. Now, the dog. He was truly alone. He checked his matches. 4 left. He had enough wood for maybe 2 hours of fire. He decided he wouldn't light it yet. He would wait until the sun went down, have one last warm moment, and then let go. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows across the snow. The cold began to tighten its grip. Elias closed his eyes, thinking of a prayer he hadn't said since he was a child. Then a sound, a scrabbling of claws on rock. Elias opened his eyes. Barnaby was sliding down the ravine wall. He wasn't alone. Clamped firmly in his jaws was a snowshoe hare. The rabbit was white, limp and bloody. The dog reached the shelter and dropped the hare on Elias's chest. He didn't eat it himself. He didn't tear off a piece. He dropped it, then licked Elias's hand, his tail wagging slowly, thumping against the frozen ground. He sat back, panting, waiting. Elias stared at the rabbit, then at the dog. Tears welled up again, hot and fast. This wasn't just food. This was a sacrifice. The dog was starving, yet he had hunted for his master first. With trembling hands, Elias skinned the rabbit. He gave the entrails and the head to Barnaby, who devoured them in seconds. Elias roasted the meat over a small fire. He ate half and gave the other half to the dog. It was the best meal he had ever tasted. It tasted like hope. That rabbit bought them 2 more days, but the winter was just beginning. Elias realized that staying in the ravine was a death sentence. No one would find them here. He had to move. With a broken leg, without a horse, he had to cross 20 miles of wilderness to reach the miner's cabin at Iron Creek. It was an impossible task, but looking at Barnaby, who was currently chewing on the rabbit bone to extract the marrow, Elias felt a surge of stubborn rage. "They think we're dead, Barnaby," Elias whispered, his voice gaining a hard edge. "They think the snow buried us, but we ain't dying. Not today." He fashioned a crutch from a sapling. He tore the rest of his spare shirt to wrap his hands. He looked at the steep climb out of the ravine. "Lead the way, partner." The climb took 6 hours. Elias crawled more than he walked. He dug his fingers into the frozen earth, pulling his weight, dragging the dead leg. Barnaby would climb ahead, find a foothold, and bark, encouraging him. When Elias slipped, Barnaby was there, bracing his body against Elias's back to stop him from sliding down. When they finally crested the ridge, the wind hit them with the force of a hammer. The world stretched out before them, endless white peaks and dark valleys. To the west lay the trail Vance and the others had taken. To the east, the long, treacherous descent toward the cabin. Elias turned west first. He looked at the tracks, now almost buried by the snow. He made a silent vow to the wind. If he lived, if he survived this winter, there would be a reckoning. But for now, survival was the only law. He turned east. "Let's go home, Barnaby." The journey to the cabin should have taken a healthy man 1 day. It took them 4 days of hallucination. 4 days where Elias would collapse in the snow, convinced he couldn't take another breath, only to feel Barnaby nudging him, nipping at his ear, forcing him up. They ate bark. They ate snow. On the 3rd night, they huddled under a fallen pine tree, shivering so violently Elias thought his teeth would shatter. "I can't," Elias whispered into the dog's fur. "I'm done, Silas. I mean Barnaby." He was confusing the dog with his brother who died in the war. "I'm tired." Barnaby let out a sharp bark right in his ear. He stood up and ran a few feet away, then looked back. He did it again. He was relentless. He refused to let his master die. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Elias saw it. A plume of smoke, not a hallucination. Real grey smoke rising from a chimney in the valley below. The miner's cabin. He stumbled. He fell. He crawled. He didn't feel his legs anymore. He was a machine made of pain and will. When he reached the door, he didn't have the strength to knock. He collapsed against the wood, sliding down to the threshold. The door opened. An old man with a white beard and a shotgun stood there. He looked down at the scarecrow of a man and the gaunt, skeletal dog beside him. "Help," Elias whispered. The old man lowered the gun. "Good Lord in heaven." Elias blacked out. When he woke, it was warm. He was in a bunk. There was a smell of stew. He panicked, patting the side of the bed. "Where is he?" "Easy, son," the old man said, stirring a pot on the stove. "The dog's right here." Barnaby was lying on a rug by the fire, a bowl of empty stew beside him. He lifted his head and thumped his tail. Elias sank back into the pillow. They had made it. They had cheated death. But as Elias stared at the ceiling, he knew the story wasn't over. This was just the prologue. The winter was here, and he was crippled. He couldn't leave. And somewhere out there, Vance was spending his share of the gold. The 7 winters had begun. Revenge is a fire that usually burns the man holding the match. But patience is the cold river that drowns him. Most men would have died in that cabin. Most men, crippled and haunted by the ghosts of betrayal, would have put a pistol in their mouth during the first long, dark month of isolation. But Elias Thorne didn't die. He didn't die because every time the darkness threatened to swallow him, he felt the heavy, comforting weight of a dog's head resting on his good knee. They say time heals all wounds, but that is a lie told by people who have never been left for dead. Time doesn't heal. It hardens. It turns grief into armor and anger into a weapon. Elias Thorne spent 7 winters in the high country, not waiting to die, but waiting to live long enough to look the devil in the eye one last time. And the dog? The dog waited with him, watching the door, watching the trail, watching the man he chose over survival. The miner's name was Jebediah Stone. He was a man carved from the same granite as the Black Hills themselves, 70 years old with hands like twisted roots and a silence that spoke volumes. He didn't ask Elias how he ended up freezing on his doorstep, and he didn't ask why a half-starved dog was guarding him like royalty. He simply boiled water, set the bones, and shared his meager rations of salted pork and beans. The first winter in the cabin was a blur of agony for Elias. His leg, shattered and poorly set in the ravine, had to be rebroken by Jebediah to heal straight. It was a brutality that bonded the 2 men. Elias spent months bedridden, staring at the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling, listening to the wind howl like a banshee outside. Through it all, Barnaby was his anchor. The dog rarely left his side. When Elias burned with fever, Barnaby lay against his back, soaking up the tremors. When Elias wept in frustration at his helplessness, Barnaby would nudge his hand, his amber eyes filled with a quiet, ancient understanding. By the spring of 1885, Elias could hobble. He fashioned a cane from a piece of hickory, carving a wolf's head into the handle. He would never walk with his old stride again. He had a permanent hitching limp that announced his arrival before he was seen. But if his legs were slower, his eyes and hands were faster. Jebediah taught him the way of the mountain trap. He taught him how to read the snow, how to listen to the birds to know where the elk were moving. Elias wanted to leave as soon as the passes cleared. He burned with the need to find Vance, to find Grady and Kidder. He spent hours cleaning the old Navy revolver Jebediah had lent him, spinning the cylinder, whispering names to the empty chambers. "You go down there now, you die," Jebediah said one evening, puffing on a clay pipe. "You ain't ready. You got the rage, son, but you ain't got the wind. And that leg, it'll give out in a chase." Elias knew the old man was right, and there was something else. Barnaby. The ordeal in the ravine had taken a toll on the dog. Barnaby was thinner, his coat patchy. He needed time to recover just as much as Elias did. So they stayed. 1 winter turned into 2, then 3. The world down below moved on. Presidents changed, railroads expanded, towns boomed and busted. But in the high cabin at Iron Creek, time stood still. Elias and Barnaby became part of the landscape. They hunted together, a seamless unit. Elias would spot the game, and Barnaby would flank it, driving the deer or the hare toward Elias's waiting rifle. They didn't need commands. A look, a whistle, a snap of the fingers was all it took. It was during the third winter that Jebediah passed. He didn't wake up one morning. The fire had gone out, and the cold had simply reclaimed him. Elias buried him behind the cabin, under a pile of river stones to keep the scavengers away. He carved a simple cross, Jeb Stone. He gave a damn. Now it was just Elias and the dog. This was the crucible. This was where the man Elias used to be truly died, and the legend began. He stopped talking to himself and started talking exclusively to Barnaby. They had long conversations by the fire. Elias would tell the dog about his childhood in Ohio, about the woman he loved who died of the pox, and about the face of Vance when he cut the rope. Barnaby would listen, his ears twitching, occasionally letting out a huff or a thump of his tail to show he was following along. It was a solitude that would have driven a weaker man mad. But Elias found clarity in it. He began to hoard furs. He trapped beaver, fox, and marten. He wasn't doing it for money. He was doing it for resources. He knew that when he finally went down the mountain, he would need gold to buy his way into the circles Vance likely moved in. By the fifth winter, the legend of the Limp Craw Man began to circulate in the lower valleys. Trappers passing through spoke of a hermit with a demon dog who guarded the Iron Creek Ridge. They said he could shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 100 yards. They said the dog was part wolf and could smell a man's intentions. Elias avoided them. He wanted to be a ghost, but ghosts have ears. In the late autumn of the 6th year, a lost prospector stumbled upon the cabin. He was a young man, green and foolish, half frozen and terrified. Elias took him in, fed him and warmed him, just as Jebediah had done for him. The young man's name was Toby. He was talkative, desperate to fill the silence. He chatted about the news from the territories. "You hear about the big strike in Silver City?" Toby asked, slurping hot broth. "Whole town sprung up overnight. Electric lights, can you believe it? And the man running it, they say he's going to be governor one day. Real tycoon. Vance, Silas Vance." Elias froze. He was whittling a piece of firewood, his knife pausing mid-stroke. Barnaby, who had been sleeping by the hearth, lifted his head instantly, a low growl rumbling in his throat. The dog remembered the name. Even after 6 years, the dog remembered the sound of the name that meant betrayal. "Silas Vance," Elias repeated, his voice raspy from disuse. "Silver City?" "Yeah," Toby nodded. "He owns the biggest stamp mill in the territory. Rich as Croesus, but a mean son of a gun. They say he has a private army." Elias looked at Barnaby. The dog stood up, shaking off the lethargy of sleep. He walked over to Elias and pressed his nose against the man's hand. The message was clear. It is time. The 7th winter came hard and fast, but Elias didn't care. He spent the months preparing. He took the furs he had stockpiled for years, a fortune in pelts, and bundled them. He cleaned his rifle. He sharpened his knife until it could shave the hair off his arm. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror Jeb kept on the wall. The face staring back was a stranger. A thick grey beard covered his jaw. His hair was long and white. His eyes were sunk deep into his skull, burning with a cold blue fire. He looked like an Old Testament prophet who had come down from the mountain to deliver judgment. Barnaby was old now. By Elias's count, the dog was at least 12 or 13. His muzzle was entirely white. He moved stiffer in the mornings, taking a moment to stretch out his hips. But his teeth were still sharp, and his eyes were as fierce as ever. Elias worried about the journey. The descent to Silver City was 50 miles of rough country. "You don't have to go, old boy," Elias whispered, kneeling down to rub the dog's ears. "You can stay here. I'll leave enough venison for weeks." Barnaby looked at him, then walked over to the door and scratched at it. He wasn't staying. He had a score to settle too. He had been the one Vance called a dumb animal. He had been the one offered the bribe of meat to betray his master. Barnaby was going to see this through. They left the cabin in the spring of 1891. They locked the door, leaving everything else behind. They walked down the mountain, a crippled man and an old dog, moving with a singular, terrifying purpose. Silver City was a scar on the earth. It was a place of noise, smoke, and mud. The constant rhythmic pounding of the stamp mills echoed through the valley like a heartbeat of industry. Elias rode into town on a mule he had traded some furs for at a lower outpost, with Barnaby trotting beside him. The town was an assault on the senses. Elias hadn't seen this many people in 7 years. The smell of unwashed bodies, horse manure, and coal smoke made him nauseous. People stared at them. They stared at the wild-looking mountain man in the buckskins and the massive wolf-like dog that limped slightly at his side. Elias sold his furs at the trading post. The trader tried to cheat him, offering half their worth. Elias simply leaned over the counter, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, and stared until the man corrected the price. He walked out with a heavy pouch of gold and silver coins. He needed information. He needed to know the lay of the land. He found a boarding house that allowed dogs, mostly because the owner was afraid to tell Elias no, and paid for a week in advance. He bathed, shaved his beard down to a manageable length, and bought a dark suit. When he walked out the next morning, he still looked dangerous, but he looked like a dangerous man with money, which in Silver City commanded respect. He located Vance's operation. It wasn't hard. The Vance Mining and Coal sign hung over the largest building in town, a 3-story brick structure that served as both office and residence. Guards with Winchester rifles stood at the entrance. Elias spent 3 days watching. He sat on a bench in the plaza, feeding scraps of ham to Barnaby, just watching the comings and goings. He saw Grady on the 2nd day. The man had grown fat. He wore a bowler hat and walked with the arrogance of a man who thinks he is untouchable. He was the foreman, barking orders at the miners coming off shift. Seeing him made Elias's blood run cold. He didn't see Kidder. Perhaps the boy was dead, or perhaps he had run off. But on the 3rd day he saw Vance. A carriage pulled by 2 black stallions pulled up to the office. The door opened and Silas Vance stepped out. He was older, his hair thinning, dressed in fine silk and wool. He looked soft. He looked happy. He was laughing at something the driver said, lighting a cigar with a gold lighter. Barnaby saw him too. The dog was lying at Elias's feet, apparently asleep. But the moment Vance stepped onto the pavement, Barnaby's head snapped up. A low, vibrating growl started in his chest, so deep Elias could feel it through the soles of his boots. The dog's lips curled back, revealing yellowed but lethal fangs. "Easy," Elias whispered, placing a hand on the dog's neck. "Not yet. Not here." Elias had a plan. He wasn't going to just shoot them in the street. That was too quick. That was too kind. They had left him to starve, to freeze, to despair. He wanted them to feel that same cold dread. He wanted to take everything from them before he took their lives. That night, Elias went to the saloon where he knew Grady played poker. The place was packed, thick with smoke and the sound of a tinny piano. Elias walked in, the cane tapping rhythmically on the floorboards. Barnaby heeled perfectly at his side. The crowd parted. A dog in a saloon was unusual, but a dog that looked like Barnaby, battle-scarred, huge and silent, was a deterrent to any drunken comments. Elias found the high-stakes table in the back. Grady was there, a pile of chips in front of him, sweating through his shirt. "Seat open?" Elias asked. His voice was gravel, unfamiliar even to himself. Grady looked up. He looked at the white hair, the scar on the cheek, the cane. He didn't recognize the man he had left in a ravine 7 years ago. He just saw a stranger with cold eyes. "Buy-in is 500, Grady grunted, turning back to his cards. Elias dropped a heavy bag of gold dust on the table. It landed with a thud that silenced the nearby conversations. "Deal me in." The game lasted for hours. Elias played methodically. He wasn't gambling, he was dissecting. He watched Grady's tics, his nervousness. He bled the man dry, hand by hand. Grady grew more agitated, drinking whiskey to calm his nerves, which only made him reckless. By midnight, Grady was out of chips. He was red-faced and desperate. "I'll bet my share of the deed," Grady slurred. "Small claim up north, worth a fortune." "I don't want your deed," Elias said softly. "I want your watch." Grady blinked. He pulled out a gold pocket watch. "This? It's just a watch." "I like it," Elias said. "Put it in the pot." Grady threw it in. He lost the hand with a pair of jacks against Elias's trip kings. Elias raked in the pot. He picked up the watch and opened it. Inside there was an inscription. To Elias, from Martha. It was his watch. They had taken it off him before they threw him down the ravine, or maybe raided his saddlebags after. Elias snapped the watch shut. He looked at Grady, and for the first time he smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "You steal this, friend?" Elias asked. "Won it off a dead man," Grady lied, spitting on the floor. "Some fool who didn't know how to ride. Is that so?" Elias leaned forward. Barnaby stood up slowly, his eyes locked on Grady's throat. "I heard a story about a man named Elias Thorne. Heard he fell in a ravine. Heard his partners left him for the wolves." Grady froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. He stared at Elias, really looked at him this time. He looked at the blue eyes. He looked at the dog. "My God," Grady whispered. "You're a ghost." "No," Elias said, standing up. "Ghosts are done with their business. I'm just getting started." The saloon went quiet. Grady scrambled back, his chair crashing to the floor. He fumbled for the pistol at his hip, but his hands were shaking too hard. "Tell Vance," Elias said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Tell him the winter is here. Tell him the dog didn't die." Elias turned and walked out, the tap-tap-tap of his cane echoing like a countdown. Barnaby followed, pausing only once to look back at Grady and bare his teeth in a silent snarl. They walked out into the cool night air. The first part was done. The fear had been planted. Now they would water it with blood. But as they turned the corner toward the hotel, a shadow detached itself from the alleyway. It was a woman. She was dressed in rags, her face obscured by dirt and shadows. She stepped in front of Elias, blocking his path. Barnaby moved to intercept, but he didn't growl. He sniffed the air and let out a soft whine. "Elias," she whispered. Elias stopped. He knew that voice. It was a voice from a life he thought had vanished. "Sarah?" he asked, stunned. It was Kidda's sister. The boy, Kidda, had brought her west years ago. "You have to stop," she said, grabbing his sleeve. "They know you're here. They've known since you hit town. It's a trap, Elias. Kidda. Kidda is on the roof across the street. He has a rifle. A bullet travels faster than the speed of sound. That means you don't hear the shot that kills you. You only hear the ones you survive." In the dark, muddy street of Silver City, Elias Thorne heard the crack of a Winchester rifle echo off the brick facades a split second after a puff of dust exploded from the wooden boardwalk inches from his boot. It was the sound of Judgment Day arriving, not for him, but for the men who had underestimated the patience of a dead man. 7 years of silence were over. The winter was no longer in the mountains. It had come to town, bringing with it a man with a limp and a dog that remembered every scent of betrayal. This wasn't just a gunfight. It was a reckoning. The bullet splinters sprayed against Elias's shin, but he didn't flinch. He moved with a speed that belied his crippled leg, throwing himself into the shadows of the alleyway, dragging Sarah down with him. Barnaby, growling low and deep, was already moving, his grey form blending into the darkness like smoke. "Stay down," Elias hissed to the woman. "It's Kidder," Sarah sobbed, pressing herself against the damp brick wall. "He's scared, Elias. Vance told him you were coming to kill us all. He's up on the livery stable roof." Elias looked at the roofline across the street. He could see the faint silhouette of a rifle barrel against the moonlight. Kidder, the boy who had been too weak to stand up to Vance 7 years ago, was now too terrified to lower his weapon. He was a pawn, just like the horse that had died in the ravine. "Barnaby," Elias whispered. He pointed not at the roof, but at the back of the stable. "Go. Flush." The dog understood. He didn't bark. He simply vanished into the gloom, circling the building to find the rear entrance. Elias waited. He checked the load in his revolver. 5 shots. He didn't want to kill the boy. Killing Kidder wouldn't fix the leg, and it wouldn't bring back the 7 years. But Vance was a different matter. High on the roof, Kidder was shaking. He peered over the sights, sweating despite the chill. He had seen the ghost. He had seen the white hair and the cane. Suddenly, a chaotic noise erupted from inside the stable below him. Horses screamed, kicking their stalls, the sound of a heavy body crashing against wood. Barnaby was in there, spooking the livestock, creating panic. Distracted, Kidder turned his head. That was the moment Elias stepped out from the alley, leveling his pistol. He didn't aim for the boy. He aimed for the weather vane spinning directly above Kidder's head. Bang! The metal rooster spun violently with a screech of impact. Kidder yelped, dropping his rifle and scrambling back, slipping on the shingles. He nearly fell, clinging to the gutter, sobbing. "Go home, boy." Elias's voice boomed through the empty street. It wasn't the voice of a ghost. It was the voice of a father disciplining a child. "Throw down the gun and ride out. Don't look back." There was a pause, a terrible silence where life and death hung in the balance. Then the rifle clattered to the ground in the street. The sound of running boots faded into the night. Kidder chose life. Elias walked over and picked up the rifle. He broke it open, checking the chamber. Full. He looked at Barnaby, who trotted out of the stable, looking satisfied. The dog had done his job without biting a soul. "One left," Elias said. They walked toward the Vance Mining and Cumber building. The guards who usually stood out front were gone. The commotion, the gunshot, and the rumors spreading from the saloon had done their work. Rats abandon a sinking ship, and hired guns abandon a haunted man. The front door was locked. Elias didn't knock. He used the butt of the Winchester rifle to smash the glass pane, reaching in to turn the latch. He stepped into the plush lobby. It smelled of expensive tobacco and fear. A single lamp burned in the upstairs office. Elias climbed the stairs, the heavy thud of his boots and the tap of his cane announcing his arrival. Barnaby walked ahead, his hackles raised, a low rumble emanating from his chest. He could smell him, the scent of the man who had held the jerky, the scent of the man who had laughed. Elias kicked the office door open. Silas Vance sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He looked smaller than Elias remembered. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a frantic, sweaty desperation. A safe was open behind him, stuffed with cash and deeds. He was packing to run. Vance looked up, his hands freezing on a stack of banknotes. He saw the man in the doorway, the long white hair, the scarred face, the eyes that held the coldness of the ravine, and he saw the dog. The dog he had left for dead was now standing on his Persian rug, looking at him with an intelligence that was terrifying. "Elias," Vance stammered, forcing a smile that looked like a grimace. I knew you'd make it. I told Grady, didn't I? I said, Elias is too tough to die. I was just holding your share, partner. It's all here, interest and all." Elias walked into the room. He didn't point the gun. He just walked until he was standing in front of the desk. Barnaby circled the desk, cutting off Vance's path to the door. "You left me," Elias said softly. "You took my horse. You took my boots." "It was a hard call," Vance cried, backing his chair against the wall. "It was survival. You know the code of the West." "I know the code," Elias said. "The code says you don't leave a partner behind. The code says you don't steal a man's life." Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold watch he had taken from Grady. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed on the pile of money with a heavy clink. "Grady gave me this back," Elias said. "He won't be needing it. He's riding south, fast." Vance's eyes darted to the drawer of his desk. Elias saw the look. He knew that look. It was the same calculation Vance had made at the edge of the cliff. "Don't," Elias warned. But Vance was a man cornered. He ripped the drawer open, pulling out a snub-nosed revolver. He never got the shot off. Barnaby moved. It wasn't the movement of an old dog. It was the strike of a wolf. He launched himself over the desk, a blur of fur and teeth. He didn't go for the throat. He went for the hand holding the gun. His jaws clamped down on Vance's wrist with the force of a hydraulic press. Vance screamed, the gun flying out of his hand and skittering across the floor. The chair tipped over, sending Vance and the dog crashing to the ground. Barnaby stood over him, his paws on Vance's chest, his teeth bared inches from the man's face. The growl was deafening, a primal roar that shook the room. "Call him off!" Vance shrieked, shielding his face. "He'll kill me! Call him off!" Elias leaned against the desk, resting his weight on his cane. He watched the scene. He watched the man who thought he owned the world cower beneath the animal he had deemed worthless. "He waited 7 winters for this," Elias said calmly. "I don't think I will call him off." "I'll give you everything," Vance sobbed. "The mine, the town, take it." Elias looked around the opulent office. He saw the portraits of ancestors Vance didn't have, the books he hadn't read. "I don't want your gold, Silas. I found something up on that mountain worth more than this." Elias whistled, a sharp 2-note sound. Barnaby stopped growling. He looked at Elias, then back at Vance. Slowly, deliberately, the dog stepped off the man's chest. He didn't bite, he didn't kill. He simply sneezed, shaking his head as if clearing the scent of garbage from his nose, and walked to Elias's side. He had proven his point. He was the better creature. Elias picked up the oil lamp from the desk. He looked at the open safe, stuffed with the paper deeds and currency that Vance worshipped. "You like warmth, Silas?" Elias asked. "You left me to freeze. I figure you owe me some heat." Elias threw the lamp into the open safe. The dry papers caught instantly. The flames roared up, licking the curtains, climbing the wallpaper. "No!" Vance scrambled up, clutching his broken wrist. He looked at the fire, then at Elias. "You're crazy! You're burning a fortune!" "I'm burning your ghost," Elias said. "Come on, Barnaby." Elias and the dog turned and walked out of the office. Behind them, Vance was screaming, not in pain, but in greed, trying to pull burning stacks of money from the fire, scorching his hands, enslaved by his avarice to the very end. They walked down the stairs as the smoke alarm bells began to ring in the street. They walked out the front door and onto the boardwalk. The town was waking up. People were running toward the fire, but Elias and Barnaby walked away from it. They walked past the saloon, past the livery stable, toward the edge of town where the darkness of the plains began. They didn't stop at the edge of Silver City. They kept walking until the glow of the fire was just a dull orange smudge on the horizon behind them. They camped that night under a cottonwood tree by a stream. Elias sat by a small fire, rubbing his aching leg. Barnaby lay beside him, his head on his paws. The dog was tired. The burst of energy in the office had drained him. His breathing was heavy, rattling slightly in his chest. "We did it, boy," Elias whispered, stroking the soft fur behind the dog's ears. "It's done. No more ghosts." Barnaby thumped his tail once feebly. He looked up at Elias, his amber eyes cloudy but full of a profound peace. He licked Elias's hand, a long, slow rasp of his tongue. Then he let out a deep sigh, the kind of sigh that comes at the end of a long, hard day's work. Elias watched him. He watched the rise and fall of the dog's ribs slow down. He watched the tension leave the old dog's muscles. "You rest now," Elias said, his voice cracking. "You earned it. You waited for me. I'll wait with you now." Barnaby closed his eyes. He didn't wake up the next morning. He passed in the night, warm, fed, and beside the man he loved. He died not as a stray in a ravine, but as a hero who had conquered the mountain and the men who tried to break him. Elias buried him there, beneath the cottonwood tree. He didn't have a chisel to carve a stone, so he simply arranged the river rocks in a circle. He sat by the grave for a long time as the sun rose over the plains, painting the world in gold, the only gold that really mattered. Elias Thorne never went back to civilization. He didn't claim the mine. He didn't become a tycoon. He rode north, back toward the high country, back toward the silence. Some say he died a few years later in a blizzard. Others say he found a new cabin and lived to be 100. But the legend of the history machine tells us this: if you ever hike the ridge near Dead Man's Pass and the wind blows just right, you won't hear the howl of a wolf. You'll hear the bark of a dog echoing off the canyon walls, guarding the trail, waiting for his partner to come home. And that brings us to the end of the story of Elias and Barnaby. It's a reminder that while men may be driven by greed and fear, there is a loyalty in this world that cannot be bought, broken, or frozen. It is the loyalty of a good dog. I hope this story stays with you the next time you look into the eyes of your own four-legged friend. If you enjoyed this journey, please like, comment, and subscribe to The History Machine. I'm Hudson, and I'll see you in the next chapter of the past.